At the end of the 1990s, the United States was experiencing one of the most arrogant economic periods in its modern history. Markets were no longer just financial tools, they had become a form of belief. People stopped asking, "Is this growth real?" and instead asked only, "How long will it last?" The internet was still in its early stages, but it created a wave of extreme optimism. Companies would appear out of nowhere, their valuations would soar within days, and then they would turn into legends. During that time, the prevailing belief on Wall Street was both simple and dangerous, that the old rules no longer mattered. Analysis was no longer based purely on actual profits, but on future expectations. This shift opened the door to a new kind of economy, one built more on narrative than reality. And in this exact environment, a company called Enron emerged. At first, it didn't look different from any other. An energy company working in natural gas and electricity, relying on long-term contracts and appearing stable. But beneath the surface, a gradual transformation was taking place, one that very few people noticed at the beginning. The company was led by a man named Kenneth. He believed in a simple idea, that if markets were left without restrictions, they would naturally create efficiency and prosperity. He was politically connected and had strong relationships in Washington, which gave him significant influence within the energy sector. But this philosophy, while it sounded economic and visionary, carried a very dangerous side: less regulation. And the less regulation there is, the more freedom exists. But also, the greater the chance for corruption and manipulation. Under his leadership, Enron slowly transformed from a traditional energy company into something entirely different: an energy trader rather than an energy producer. At first glance, this transformation seemed simple, but in reality, it was the beginning of everything, because the company was no longer relying mainly on producing electricity or natural gas. Instead, it began relying on trading contracts connected to them, and that meant something extremely important. The company's profits were now based on expectations, not on real production. Then came the man who would truly change everything: Jeffrey Skilling. He was intelligent, quick-thinking, and deeply convinced that traditional companies were slow and inefficient. He believed the future was not in production, but in turning everything into a market. When he joined Enron, he didn't ask, "How do we produce more?" Instead, he asked a completely different question: "How do we turn everything into a tradable commodity?" Under his influence, Enron began transforming into something entirely new. It was no longer just an energy company. It became a massive trading platform. Energy was no longer simply a product to be consumed. It became a financial asset to be speculated on. Everything became something that could be priced: risk, contracts, and even future expectations. And this transformation pushed the company into a completely different world: the world of finance instead of industry. But that world operates by a very dangerous rule. If the beautiful story stops, everything collapses. As the company expanded, a new kind of pressure began to emerge inside Enron. Investors demanded constant growth. The market would not tolerate decline. The media praised the company's rapid performance, but the reality inside the business was not always as perfect as it appeared. Some projects were far less profitable than expected. Some contracts were complicated or losing money altogether. But in a company like Enron, there was no room for bad news, because the company had become dependent on a single image: continuous growth. And this is where the first small deviation began: adjusting the numbers instead of admitting the truth. At first, it seemed minor: delaying a loss here, reclassifying an expense there. But those small adjustments slowly began to accumulate, and over time, Enron stopped reflecting reality and started reflecting an improved version of it. Inside this system, one very important name began to emerge: Andrew Fastow. He was responsible for building the company's complex financial structures. He created what were known as special purpose entities. The name sounded technical, but their purpose was actually very simple: to hide losses outside the company's books. Every time Enron lost money, the loss would not appear in the official accounts. Instead, it would be transferred into these entities. As a result, the company's financial reports remained clean, or at least appeared to be. In reality, the losses had not disappeared. They had simply been moved out of sight, and over time, this system became more and more complicated until it eventually became a core part of how the company operated. Inside the company, Enron was not just a financial corporation. It was an environment of intense psychological pressure. Every employee was evaluated harshly. The best performers were rewarded, and the weakest were pushed out. This system created a single culture: fear of failure. People stopped asking difficult questions because the wrong question could mean the end of a career. In an environment like that, truth becomes a burden, not a value. And slowly, silence began spreading throughout the company. A silence that allowed the lie to grow without resistance. Over time, Enron was no longer just a company interacting with the market. It became a company interacting with numbers themselves. At this stage, the goal was no longer to improve real performance, but to improve the appearance of performance in financial reports. Profits had to keep rising, even if they weren't rising in reality. And here, the most dangerous idea in the company's history began. If the result was bad, it wasn't fixed, it was rewritten. At first, it seemed very simple: delaying the recognition of losses or reclassifying certain financial items. But these small adjustments were only the beginning. Over time, the numbers began to be constructed in advance, not based on what had actually happened, but on what needed to happen for everything to look successful. And so Enron began living in a dual reality: one real world inside its operations, and another carefully designed world for Wall Street. At the center of this system, Andrew Fastow was developing something even more complex. It was no longer just one or two entities. It became an entire network of outside companies. These entities had different names, but they all served the same purpose: keeping losses away from the official books. Every loss was moved outside the main system. Every problem was legally hidden inside a complicated financial structure. What made it especially dangerous was that these entities were not truly independent. They were directly connected to Enron, yet presented to the world as separate organizations. And through this system, the company managed to create a very dangerous illusion: a company generating consistent profits with almost no losses. But the truth was that the losses had never disappeared. They had simply been accumulating in the shadows. Outside the company, the picture looked completely different. Wall Street saw a company growing at an astonishing speed. The stock price kept rising. Analysts recommended buying. Financial media described Enron as a revolution in the energy sector. No one expected that behind those impressive numbers was a complex financial structure designed to hide reality. But a major part of the problem was psychological. Everyone wanted to believe the story, because accepting the truth would mean losing money. And so, Enron became more than just a company deceiving others. It became a company that everyone was unknowingly helping to support. Inside Enron, the environment was even harsher than it appeared from the outside. Every employee was under constant evaluation. An internal system divided workers into categories. The best were rewarded, the average were pressured, and the weakest were eliminated. This system created an environment that allowed no room for mistakes, and no room for truth either, because telling the truth could mean you were not positive enough. And as a result, you would be pushed aside. Over time, silence became the safest option. Even accountants who could see the problems began avoiding difficult questions. As the system expanded, it was no longer just about hiding losses. Something even more dangerous began to happen, creating profits that did not actually exist. Some contracts were recorded as full profits immediately, even though they were supposed to last for many years, which meant the company was pulling future profits into the present. In other words, Enron was living on income that had not yet been earned. But this system had one critical condition. Growth had to continue forever, because the moment growth stopped, the gap between reality and the numbers would be exposed. At this stage, Enron had become like a massive structure made of financial paper. It looked powerful from the outside, but internally, it depended on expectations, delays, and numbers that were not real. And the only question getting closer was this: what happens when the market finally stops believing? In early 2001, something began to change. Analysts started asking more precise questions. The numbers were becoming harder to understand, and most importantly, cash flow was no longer matching the reported profits. That was the first real warning sign, because profits can be manipulated, but real cash is much harder to fake. Slowly, doubts began to spread, but inside Enron there was complete denial. Over time, investors began to feel concerned. The stock, which had been steadily rising, started to fluctuate. Then, it began to fall. $90, 70, 50, 30. Each drop increased the panic inside the company, because Enron wasn't just losing money, it was losing its most important asset: trust. When the truth began to leak out, there was nothing left that could stop it. Complex financial entities began to collapse under pressure. Banks started demanding real information. The press began uncovering the details, and the market began to understand something dangerous: that the profits were not as real as they seemed. Within weeks, Enron went from a giant corporation to a company in complete collapse. Then came the official announcement: bankruptcy filing. One of the largest bankruptcies in the history of the United States. After the collapse, federal investigations began. What was uncovered was more than just an accounting error. It was an entire system: systematic manipulation, hiding billions of dollars in debt, creating fake profits, and pressuring employees into silence. Major leaders such as Kenneth, Jeff Skilling, and Andrew Fastow were prosecuted. Some of them went to prison. But the truth went beyond individuals. There was a whole system that allowed deception to become a business model. In the end, Enron was no longer just a collapsed company. It became a global symbol, a symbol of corporate greed and of the danger of building success on illusion. Because truth always follows the same rule: it can be delayed, it can be hidden, but it cannot be erased. And the moment the story becomes more important than reality, collapse becomes only a matter of time.